Thank you very much for inviting me and for coming. And I hope that most, at least, of what I have to say will make you think it was a good idea that you did that tonight instead of the other things you might have done. I want to appreciate this radio station. As I travel the country, it's become clear to me that some years ago, when, like other people, I thought that radio was a medium that was really no longer important, how completely wrong that is. I never did any radio before. I started in March of 2011 at WBAI in New York City, which is also a Pacifica station. And we're now on just shy of 49 stations around the United States. It is really a remarkable thing. Almost all of those stations came to us to carry the program, and it's because of the radio program that most of the rest of my life has been turned into major turmoil, which I did not foresee, but about which I am, to be honest, very happy. I've been a critic of capitalism most of my adult life. My teachers at the universities I attended really made every effort. Some of them were even good teachers. They made every effort to persuade me that capitalism really was wonderful. They tried. It just didn't work. Kept trying to see it their way, but too much had happened. Too much was happening to my family and me, and I couldn't. You know, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, which is an economic disaster from the time I was born right to this minute. And to live in that environment and to know the story of Youngstown, which is the story of Detroit and of Cleveland and of Camden, New Jersey, and of hundreds of others, is to understand that there's something terribly wrong in this economic system. And so when your teachers tell you it's a wonderful engine of efficiency, you've got a problem. And I resolved that problem by becoming a critic of capitalism. But for most of the last 30 years, it was not possible here in the United States, and I'm going to come back and explain why that was, but it wasn't possible to say that. People got nervous when you talked like that. They looked at you funny. You began to feel as though you either had a very bad case of BO or you were scaring folks by what you were saying. So it quickly became clear that it wouldn't be good for my career as a professor to talk like that. And it wouldn't do me any good with my neighbors to talk like that. And so, like most people, I didn't stop talking like that. A lot of people did that. I couldn't go that far. But I learned to dance around what had to be said, to say it in less troubling ways. And the good news is that ever since I've been on the radio, I've tried to put that aside, because something happened in 2008 and 9 that changed everything. And it's now been possible for me to say pretty much what I think, pretty straightforwardly, without the dancing, without the circumlocutions. And it's been the radio that's been my experimental way to see what I could say. So I'm here to tell you how very important this radio station that you have here is, and the others like it, because they are creating platforms and opportunities for lots of us to do things we couldn't and wouldn't have done otherwise. In the last couple of years, for example, just to be personal for a moment, I've been on, Bill Moyer's interview twice, Charlie Rose, Up with Chris Hayes, Amy Goodman, and some of you may have seen me on Bill Maher's comedy show. In each of those cases, I asked a question backstage before we did the taping or the live show. And I asked, Can you tell me why you invited me here? Since these are the kinds of shows that up until very recently would not have dreamed of doing that. And in each case, the producer or assistant producer who finally answered my question, they all gave me exactly the same answer, which I didn't expect. They said it had taken some time to persuade the people who make the decision to invite me. But the reason they were able to do so was because, and then I would get a smile, all of us here listen to you on the radio. So for those of you who pay attention, it's not just the size of the audience, but it's who finds their way to listen to the programs on KPFA and K and here KPFT and BAI and so on. It's a remarkable community. 3 days ago, on the 10th of November, I spoke for a meeting very much like this for a station called WMNF in Tampa, Florida, St. Petersburg. And 500 people showed up and bought tickets to support that station and to listen to what I have to say. And this is happening to me now on a regular basis. And it's the radio that has created much of what passes as my opportunities these days. So I am deeply grateful to the radio, and I want you to know that supporting it financially and every other way is supporting an absolutely crucial institution at this point in American history. Huge numbers of Americans are becoming aware that they're living in an economic system that doesn't work. They're frightened by that, they're troubled by that, they don't know quite what to do about it. But if they can find a radio station with interesting information to help them process that, they are looking in a way they haven't for decades. So this is the time to step up and make these stations work. And you have a good one here, and all I can say is help it. It's a way of helping move this country in a direction it would not otherwise go. Okay, let me turn then to what I was going to say for this evening. I want to start by talking about how a critic of capitalism in the United States today sees it. Put it kind of all together for you, and then ask and answer a question. If capitalism looks anything like what I'm about to describe, then why isn't there much more of a mass movement in the United States to change it? So first, let me do the description. We'll begin with 2008. Capitalism as a global system crashed in 2008. There is no way around this. There is no fancy way of pretending it didn't happen. It crashed. It is currently called in the media the Great Recession, which is a nod to understanding that it's the worst breakdown of capitalism since the Great Depression of the 1930s. That one, just to remind those of you that don't remember or haven't studied this, that one started in 1929 and lasted until 1941. It was therefore a good 11, 12 years. It was awful. In 1933, the worst moment, unemployment rate was 25%, 5 times what it is now. The President of the United States made a famous speech in which he said 1/3 of America goes to bed hungry every night, does not have adequate clothing, does not have adequate shelter. Amazing thing for a president to say, and it was an underestimate of what it was. So here we are again, 2008, another crash. The second major crash of capitalism in 75 years. That's enough information to say, whoops, maybe we better look into this. That's not a very good record, but we're just beginning. There's something called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a government-funded body that keeps track of the ups and downs of capitalist economies around the world, particularly the United States. According to it, and that's what the economics profession accepts, between the end of the Great Depression in 1941 and the beginning of what we're in now, the Great Recession of 2008, there were, ready, 11 other economic downturns. Some were short and shallow, others were large and long and deep. 11 downturns between two really bad ones. You may not have ever realized it, but every president since Franklin Roosevelt, and indeed many before, but every president since Franklin Roosevelt has been sitting as a president during an economic downturn. That's how often they happen. And by downturn, I mean a sudden laying off of millions of workers, a cutting back, a collapse of many businesses, particularly small ones, etc., etc. Capitalism, in short, is an extraordinarily unstable system. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Or you would have demanded that this roommate get some professional help. You ought to wonder why you stay with an economic system that is so unstable. And you know, the people who run capitalism are aware that its instability is a serious problem. So they've been working for 250 years, ever since capitalism became a dominant system. They've been trying to figure out some way, somehow, to prevent these things. In fact, every president makes two promises when the economy turns down. Promise number one, if you follow my policies, we will get us out of this great downturn. Promise number two, and if you follow my policies, not only will we get out of the downturn, but we'll make sure it never plagues our children. Every president has made that promise. No president has ever delivered on it. We're in one now, proof positive. They can't. There's a new school of economics over the last 50 years called Keynesian economics, named after a British economist, John Maynard Keynes, who in the depths of the Great Depression of the 1930s wrote a very famous book analyzing not only what had happened as he looked around an absolutely distraught United Kingdom. The Depression was bitter there. But he came up with elaborate monetary and fiscal policies. The very monetary and fiscal policies that the Federal Reserve and the Congress are now using. They were supposed to prevent us from having another economic downturn. I rest my case. It didn't work. This system is unstable and nobody has figured out what in the world can be done, so we simply live through the instability. With many of us hoping that when the downturn comes, it won't be us. We'll be spared. We won't be where the axe falls. Kind of strange. It means that we're hoping that the axe falls on somebody else, which is less than charitable. Capitalism is an unstable system, bitterly so. Every social ill we have is made worse when there's unemployment, mental health problems, physical health problems, break-up families, destroyed relationships, postponed children, postponed marriages. You name it, it gets worse with unemployment, nor is that a terrible surprise, is it? We foist that on ourselves because we can't, for reasons I'll get into in a few minutes. We can't seem to have a conversation in this country about capitalism and whether its strengths and weaknesses aren't perhaps indicative that the time has come to ask a basic question, which is, can't we do better than this? Let me turn next to another feature of capitalism, which I, as a critic, find stunning. The feature is called inequality of income and wealth. Here are some statistics for this year. According to the UN and other agencies, we passed a milestone this year. The richest 1% of the people on Earth, the whole planet, now own more than half the liquid wealth. And the other 99% are fighting with one another for the other half. What? I can't repeat it, it hurts. Here in the United States, the top 10% have half the income and more than half the wealth. Same thing. Extreme inequality. New York City just passed a milestone. I live in New York City. One-bedroom apartment, average price now is over $1 million. It's an average in New York that includes not just the rich folks in Manhattan, but the really poor ones in the Bronx. Like most American cities, we have extremes, just like you do here in Houston. And with that go every conceivable kind of problem. The gentrification of our cities, as the minority that has money picks the neighborhoods that they would go and move in, raise up the price, drive out everybody else. Last year there was a bestseller by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, called Capital in the 21st Century. Bestseller in Europe and here. 600-odd pages showing that wherever capitalism has become dominant, it has produced an ever-growing gap between rich and poor. Periodically, societies rebel against the inequality, and for a time, it gets reduced. In a few minutes, I'm going to go through the American experience with that in the 1930s. But as soon as that period passes, the basic pressure of capitalism, the way it works, again produces wealth upon wealth for a few and growing hard times for everybody else. Our capitalism has really done some remarkable things in the last few years. We are now the first generation of students who cannot get a bachelor's degree without $30,000 to $50,000 on average of debt. We are the only industrial country to do that. We are pioneers of a sort, yet again. Pioneers of debt. Just like between 1970 and now, we were the pioneers in ratcheting up total amount of debt for our working class. No working class in the world had ever done before. Debt for your home, that's a mortgage, debt for your car, debt on your credit card, and now debt to get a bachelor's degree. And you all know the truth, right? You really do. That a bachelor's degree is worth less in terms of your career than it ever has been, and you're borrowing more than ever to get what is less worth it now than ever. What kind of society does this? We're just as good as the people in the rest of the world, but what are we doing to ourselves? Educated people is the way forward. Every economist, left-winger, right-winger, and center, teaches in his or her classes that in the world economy we now live in, the best bet you have to do well in the years ahead is if you have an educated, trained labor force. It's the quintessential thing you need. And what are we doing in our society? Making it impossible for large numbers of people to get an education. And if they do get it, to burden them with a level of debt that are going to make them nervous wrecks before they reach adulthood. impeding their education. 12 Ways to Sunday. And what else does the inequality do? Well, it corrupts our politics, as those things do always. As fewer and fewer people become richer and richer in our society, and the mass of people can't participate in the process, the rich people aren't stupid. They understand that this situation is not sustainable in a society that has universal suffrage. The logic here is crystal clear. If a tiny number of people are walking away with most of the economic prizes, it's only a matter of time before the average people who don't have those prizes wake up one day, scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, we're the majority, we have therefore the majority of the votes, let's use what we can do politically, with the majority, to undo what has happened in the economy where we have been excluded from the benefits. And the wealthy understand that, so the first thing they have to do to secure their position is to block any chance for politics to work that way. And how have we done that in this country? By making politics a matter of money. The politician can't run unless he/she raises umpteen thousands of dollars. The parties can't function without big money. I don't know if you saw the statistic, about 156 families in America are providing more than half of the money so far raised by the presidential candidates. 156 families in a country of 325 million people. I mean, you've got to be nuts not to see that our political situation is now that the people who get elected understand, I talk with them all the time, that they'd love to do, I don't doubt that, they'd love to do what the mass of the people in their district believe, but they can't, because the mass of the people don't provide them with the money they have to run. And if they do what the people with the money don't want them to do, the people with the money will give it to somebody else, and they'll be last week's headline. So they sit and they say to me, I can't do what I believe in, and I can't do what you're asking me to do, because the people with the money don't want it. And what good am I to you if I do what you want, and then I'm out of here, being replaced by someone who's gonna do what the money wants? What is my answer to that? You should be a noble person and go down fighting? I could say that, but I know what the result would be. The conversation would come to a screeching halt, and I would be shown which way to get to the door. And I understand that. But that's the way this economic system works. Some years ago, this capitalist system also made another decision, whose drama I cannot exaggerate. But the leading capitalists in this society decided, particularly in the 1970s, to do something which I'm going to state to you in a very dramatic way, but I want to drive it home. They basically decided to abandon the United States. They decided to go someplace else. The rest of the world was desperate, poor, impoverished, desperate for jobs, desperate for income, and basically said to American corporations, why in the world are you paying $20, $40, $60, $80 an hour when you can come to our country and pay that per month? And American businesses said, oh, that's a good idea. And they left. They've been leaving for 40 years. Let me tell you a story, just one example. Detroit, Michigan, best example I know. In 1970, it was the example of a successful capitalism. Presidents of the United States brought foreign visitors to Detroit. Look at the thriving factories, chiefly GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Look at all these workers earning good money, and they did. members of what was then the strongest labor union in America, the United Auto Workers. So amazing was the city that even African Americans coming up from the South, who had been for a long time excluded from decent jobs in this country, were able to get, slowly but steadily, jobs in the auto factory, membership in the UAW, so that the president could point to African American working people with a decent, secure job, benefits, able to send their kids to school. It was even a little bit integrated, not where people live, but in the workplace. Wow. But here's the killer. Population in 1970, just shy of 2 million people. So thriving was this place that it produced, particularly again the African American community, a new kind of music. Remember the Motown sound? Changed the world's music. It was a cultural center, it was economically prosperous, it was capitalism on display. Now today, the population of Detroit today is 700,000 people. Do you understand? The majority of the people of Detroit were driven out of their homes. They had no work. They had no way to survive. They were forced out. 1.3 million out of 2. Today, Detroit is the largest urban bankruptcy in the history of the United States. No city that size has had to go into bankruptcy, and they are still in bankruptcy now. For a while, there was a famous story. Apparently it's not true anymore. It turned out that many Detroit families, as they left town because there's no work, closed up their house, abandoned their house. By the way, if any of you have a chance to go to Detroit, spend a few hours, drive around. It will leave an impression that you will never forget. Never forget. Abandoned houses, burnt down houses, block after block after block. Looks like a bomb hit the place. Anyway, as people left, they couldn't afford the dog. So they said a tearful goodbye to the dog and drove out. Meanwhile, the city, because everybody was leaving and everybody was unemployed because there were no more car factory jobs, they weren't paying any taxes, these unemployed people, because they weren't earning anything. So the city had no tax money. So one of the things it did is laid off the dog wardens, the people who go around getting the strays. Okay, now, little biology lesson. Lots of dogs on their own, going into the abandoned houses, doing things I can't discuss, producing lots more dogs, and no warden to interfere in the process. Detroit began to have a problem of wild dogs hurting people. The peak of capitalist efficiency within 25 years has got a problem we normally associate with the Kalahari Desert. What? That's this country. I recently visited Camden, New Jersey. It's the same story. My hometown, Youngstown, same story. Cleveland, same story, and so on. Capitalists abandon, and when they abandon, they leave. The disaster they leave behind. The city with no jobs, the people with no jobs, the families thrown, the city that can't function, the city that's bankrupt, the city that shrinks. The whole country is faced with this reality. You all know that, right? You have, like we do in New York, the experience that you call the local electric company to complain about a problem in your line, and you're talking to Bangladesh. You need help with your computer because the software is a glitch, you're talking to India. The jobs are gone. They've been going for 40 years. For 40 years in Detroit, The mayors of Detroit watched this process. The governors of Michigan watched the process. The presidents of the United States, Republican and Democrat alike, watched the process, and nobody could figure out what to do. So it just went on. People without work, jobs that you can't get anymore, money therefore not coming to the government because people unemployed don't pay taxes, so the government cuts back the services, the public services. So in addition to having our jobs pinched, our government services, this is a system that isn't working for the majority of the people. Well, then let me ask the big question. Why isn't there something happening about this? Why are we as a nation, apparently, with some exceptions, but by and large, just acting like there's nothing wrong, that there's nothing amiss, that there's nothing going on? Well, let me answer the question by telling you a little bit about your history as an American. And if you don't know this history, think about what that means. Here we go, quick. 1930s is the Great Depression, much worse than what we have now. What do the American people do? They act, and they act big, and they act dramatically. First, and most important, millions upon millions of people, many of them unemployed, decide to join labor unions. The greatest union organizing drive in American history. We never had anything like it before. We've never had anything like it since. In the midst of the Depression, working people in America made a decision that they could get through this depression better if they were in a union than if they weren't. So they joined unions. These were people who had never been in a union before and whose parents had never been in a union. Second, tens of thousands of people joined two different socialist parties. Socialist parties. Again, I have to always remind American audiences that the socialist movement has been strong in American history at various times. I like to do it by asking a little quiz. I won't do that. What's the state in the United States that elected the most socialists to the state legislature?
Wisconsin.
No.
Oklahoma?
Oklahoma.
Bingo. Good. Oklahoma. How many of you think you would have guessed, of all the 50 states, Oklahoma? You would have guessed Wisconsin, because that's a logical guess. Or New York, or Massachusetts, or something like that. No, Oklahoma. Famous today for its strong socialist movement. But it did have one once. In the 1930s, tens of thousands of Americans joined the Socialist Party, two parties. And also tens of thousands joined the American Communist Party. Indeed, the Communists and the Socialists worked together with John L. Lewis, the head of the Mine Workers Union, to organize the workers into this new kind of union called the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, the second half of the AFL-CIO. Fantastic movement of militants. They marched in the streets almost every day. Tens of millions of people were organized by socialists, communists, and unionists working together. A right-winger's nightmare. And they went and they had a meeting with President Roosevelt. The president had to meet with them because he represented a huge part of his constituents. And the meeting with Roosevelt went roughly like this, I'm paraphrasing. Mr. President, you've got to help the millions of people that are out of work. You've got to do something, and you've got to do something right away. The unspoken message, because it didn't have to be stated, was this. If you don't, Mr. President, we're not going to vote for you, and you're not going to be president much longer. The socialists and the communists added a little kicker. And if you don't do something, Mr. President, we're going to make a revolution here like they had in Russia. Ha 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 ha. Roosevelt did not laugh. But Roosevelt knew this was not a bluff. He took it seriously. So he immediately had a meeting with the corporations and the rich. This was easy for him to do because he was one of them. And they were one of him. So he had a meeting and he told them what he had just heard from the communists, socialists, and the unionists. And he looked at these wealthy men and he said, I think we better do something. I think we better take care of the mass of people. I urge you to do that. And I'm afraid I have to explain to you, gentlemen, that since then millions of people are unemployed and are not paying any taxes, the cost of doing something for the mass of people is not something that the government can afford to do. You can understand that. That's where we are now. So I'm afraid, gentlemen, says the president, the only way that I can take care of the mass of people is with your money. And you're going to have to give it to me. What? He said. Yeah, he said, I know this is hard, but I urge you to give me the money, because if you don't, my feeling is these people are going to move in such a way that you're not going to have any money to give anybody. He split them. Half of them never bought this argument. Half of them did. But half was all he needed. He immediately went back to the communists, socialists, and unions and said, okay, we got a deal. I'm going to take care of you, the mass of people, but you got to stop all that talk about revolution and Russia and all that. Stop that. And the socialists and the communists and the unionists, with a few exceptions, bought the deal. And the deal was done. And Roosevelt was good to his word. He hit the rich and the corporations with massive tax increases. And he told them, what I don't tax from you, you're going to lend me at good rates. You're going to give me the money I need, and I'm going to do something for the average American. So very quickly, one, he created the Social Security system. 1933, the depths of the Depression, when there's no money in the government to do anything, the president announces that everybody 65 years of age or older will now get a check every month for the rest of their lives. Wow. Before the ink was dry, he announced the unemployment compensation system. Never had that before either, just like we had never had a Social Security system. Unemployment compensation meant if you lost your job through no fault of your own, which was the case for most people, the government would give you a check every week for 25, 50 weeks to help you through your hard time. A government that had no money was now giving a check to everybody over 65 and a check to everybody unemployed. Let me remind you, at the time, tens of millions of people were unemployed. We're not done. Then, to make sure that the people who were getting jobs were paid properly and weren't poor, he passed the first minimum wage in American history. But now I've left the biggest one for last. 1934, he says, the American people, if the private sector either cannot or will not provide work to the tens of millions of Americans who want it, then there's no alternative but for me as president to do it. Let me say that again so you all get it. If the private sector cannot provide work for millions of Americans, then I will do it as president. From 1934 to 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 15 million jobs. The money to pay those workers, the money to pay the Social Security, the money to pay the unemployment came from taxing corporations and the rich. The President of the United States taxed corporations and the rich big time to take care of the mass of people. When you hear a politician today say that can't be done, that's doubly mistaken. A, it can be, B, it has been done. It's our history. Did the politician who taxed corporations and the rich and helped the average person thereby commit political suicide? No. Mr. Roosevelt was subsequently re-elected 3 times. He's the most popular president in American history. Nobody else is even close. A politician can't do that? He did it. And it worked like a charm for him. What about the taxes on the corporations? Let me just give you 2 statistics so you understand. In 1944, State of the Union message early in the year, Roosevelt sends a message to the United States Congress saying, I propose the following tax rate on the richest Americans. Ready? 100%. Every dollar over 25,000, that was the cutoff then, would be about 400,000 today. Every dollar over 25,000, our president proposed, would be taxed at 100%. In other words, for every dollar over 25,000 you got, you wouldn't get it. Washington. It was a proposal for a maximum income. You know, like a minimum wage or a maximum income. He sent the message to Congress, the Republicans went ballistic, etc., etc. The usual theater ensued. And then they finally reached a compromise in 1944. The top rate was 94%. Every dollar over 25 you earned, you got to keep 6 cents. The other 94 cents went to Uncle Sam. The Republicans signed off on it, and the Democrats signed off on it, and the president signed it. Do you know that the top bracket on rich people stayed above 90% right through the 1940s, into the 1950s, and into the 1960s? For a generation, Republican and Democratic Congresses, Republican and Democratic presidents endorsed taxing the rich at 90-odd%. And let me remind you that the 50s and 60s were times when the unemployment was less than we've had in the last 5 years, and the rate of economic growth of the United States was much faster than it's been since. You've all lived through 25 years in which the business community has said you must cut taxes on corporations and the rich because we are the job creators. But the historical record is unmistakably exactly the opposite. As the tax rates came down in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the unemployment went up and the rate of growth went down. The opposite, the opposite, the opposite. In 1945, the federal government, which depends for most of its taxes on taxing individuals' income and corporate income, corporate profits. In 1945, for every dollar taken from individuals, you and me, the federal government got $1.50 from corporate, taxing the income of corporations. Right? For every dollar from an individual, you got $1.50 from business. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that the federal government raises from individuals, it raises from corporations 25 cents. Over the last 50 years, the burden of taxation in the United States has shifted from corporations to individuals, and from the richest individuals to the middle and the bottom. The highest rate on the rich was 94%, 91% in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The top rate today is 39%. When you're upset about taxes, please understand the reason you're upset is because the burden of taxation has been shifted from business to individuals, and from the richest individuals to the middle and the bottom. Nobody likes the taxes. Everybody feels overburdened by taxes. I understand that, but you also have to understand what has actually happened and why the burden is felt by you, given what has happened in our culture. Anyway, the war is now over, and you're going to see what the history teaches you. Corporations and the rich are furious. They've been made to pay a fortune and to take care of the mass of people. Social Security, unemployment compensation, and public jobs program. They don't like it. They want to undo the New Deal. They want to go back to the way things were before. And they're smart. They know that the problem wasn't Roosevelt. He had died anyway at the end of the war. They knew that the president only did it because of that pressure below from the unions and the socialists and the communists. So the solution they understood right away. You got to get rid of that coalition. You got to make sure that's not there to put the pressure on whoever the president might be. And Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower didn't make a difference. You had to deal with that pressure from below. So they did. First, they figured out what's the weakest link in that coalition of communists, socialists, and union. Their decision, communists. They had to be redefined. They weren't the militants who got people to join unions, which is what mostly they did. No, they were agents of a foreign power. They were scary people lurking under your bed, meaning to do you harm. And we arrested them, and we deported them, and we demonized them, and vilified, we destroyed them. We just destroyed them. As soon as that was done, we turned as a nation upon the socialists. And we basically said to the American people, the socialists, you see, are just like the communists. They just spell it differently. I like to tell the story that when I first started teaching, I noticed something very different about the United States from Europe. In Europe, wherever you go, people understand the difference between the socialists and the communists because they have socialist parties, communist parties. Everybody knows what they are and what they disagree about. Whereas here in the United States, my students mostly had the following idea. Communist, socialist, Marxist, anarchist, terrorist are synonyms. They can be used interchangeably because, and nowadays, and I believe more in your part of the country than in mine, you can add the word liberal, which is more or less the same too. You know, in my part of the country that doesn't work, but we have another option. We add the word Muslim. That seems to work for a lot of folks too. It's very strange. At first I thought Americans don't understand. It's not that. It's that period after World War II when we hammered in, it's all the same. And when we finished destroying the socialists and the communists, we went to work on the labor movement. And the labor movement has been in decline for 50 years in this country. I noticed this afternoon at lunch something that I'm going to repeat now for those of you who don't know. The private sector, which is the largest part of our economy, the percentage of workers in the private sector, which includes many of you, the percentage of workers that are either members of or represented by a union is 6.8%. 93.2% of private sector workers are not represented by a union, are not members of a union. Anyone who says to you, we got to worry about the big, powerful unions, is living on another planet. We have big, powerful corporations, but the notion that they are offset by big, powerful unions is, roughly speaking, 50 years out of date. It's wrong. It's a mirage, or worse. So heavy was the pressure to destroy communists and socialists and the labor movement that an entire generation, you and many of your folks, were terrorized for 50, 60 years. You don't join political organization, particularly from the left. There's something scary about it. You worry about it. Your instincts tell you, don't go there. Don't go to the meeting. Don't go that evening. Don't. That is a scary thing to do. And that's why we don't have more of a movement now. Because we're scared. Let me tell you about my education, since I'm a critic and I'm a professor of economics. And I mention this because I want you to know how bad it was in this country, in case you don't. I went to very elite schools. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and when I finished, I went to Stanford in California for my master's degree, and then I finished my education at Yale University, where I got my PhD. I'm a joke. I'm an elite kid. That is, I'm not from an elite family, but I went to elite schools. I got one master's degree in economics from Stanford. I got another master's degree in economics from Yale. Then I got a master's degree in history from Yale, and then I got a PhD in economics from Yale. I'm a joke. I was never required to read one word of Karl Marx's criticism of capitalism in all that time. There's no excuse for that. There's no excuse. I was put in the best schools, given the best education, and they were afraid to introduce me to the leading critic of capitalism. What is this? This is childish. If you wanted, and I use this example because I think it gets the idea across, if you wanted to understand the family that lived up the road from you, mother, father, 2 kids, and you happen to know that one of the kids thought it was the greatest family and felt blessed that he or she had been born into it. And the other one thought it was a psychological zoo that they had been born into, right? So one kid thought it was great, the other one didn't. If you were trying to understand the family, would you talk to only one of the children? Or would you think that the reasonable thing is talk to both of them and draw your own conclusions, but you talk to both of them? If you want to understand capitalism, you really think you should only read or discuss or think about the people who love it and not talk or listen to the people who don't? What possible sense does it make? You think you have nothing to learn from a critic? For 50 years in America, we've been discussing the pros and cons of our school system, our transportation system, our energy system, our medical insurance, you name it. If it's a system that's part of our society, we've talked about it and criticized it and debated it and identified its flaws and tried to fix them, with one exception: the economic system. We don't debate that. We do not debate capitalism. What are the alternatives? Why would we be interested in them? What are the flaws? We don't. It gets a pass. I once assigned my students the task: read the congressional record and find for me a debate in the House of Representatives or the Senate on the pros and cons of capitalism. Couldn't get it. Contests about the pros, in which everybody came up with the best possible list they could, but no criticism. We are now coming out of a 50-year decline in our brain power when it comes to the capitalist system. We're discovering as a nation that this is a system that has flaws, and it's a system that can be improved upon, and the world doesn't end and the sky doesn't fall if we have a logical, balanced conversation about this system and its pros and cons. we're slower than the rest of the world in getting to it because they never had the kind of repression of socialists, communists, and unionists that we had for 40 years in this country. This last week there was a general strike in Greece fighting austerity, critical of capital. The whole country came to a halt. This last week was also a week in which the government of Portugal changed, for those of you that didn't catch it. The Conservatives are out, and a new coalition is now the government of Portugal, a coalition of the Portuguese Socialist Party, the Portuguese Communist Party, and the Portuguese Green Party. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you didn't know. How many of you read newspapers but didn't make it? Didn't get in there? That's sad. Okay, last point. Everything that the people did in the 1930s, everything they did, has been undone in the last 40 years. It's been the rollback of the New Deal. Democrats did it and Republicans did it. We don't discuss now expanding Social Security. We're discussing how much to cut it. We just went through the worst unemployment that we've had since the 1930s, the Great Depression. But the amazing thing is not that we didn't have a government jobs program the way we did in the 1930s. That wasn't the stunning thing. The stunning thing was we didn't even discuss it. Neither Obama nor the Republicans talked about the program we had that worked really well back then. It's as if we all suffer a historical amnesia. Why not? Why was it a taboo to talk about what we did last time for the last 7 years? When we might have made an enormous difference in the lives of millions of Americans. You know, if the government comes and gives you a job when you're unemployed, you get enough money so you don't lose your house. That's why they did it in the 1930s. Why was that not discussed? Why was that not a debate? What in the world is going on that we can't even recoup our own history to give us some help at a time like this? They undid it. I don't know if you're aware, but the minimum wage now is not worth what it once was because we haven't kept up with inflation. So the minimum wage has been eroded from what it once was when it was instituted. And unemployment compensation is not being expanded. It's being it was temporarily increased a little bit, and now it's been undone again. I mean, nothing. Many of the other rules and regulations of the 1930s, limiting what banks could do, the famous Glass-Steagall Act that some of you have learned about, all of them been repealed or undone. What happened? Well, I'm going to conclude by telling you the lesson I see in the 1930s and in the New Deal, the crucial lesson. What Roosevelt did was what we nowadays call redistribution of income. He took money from the rich and he gave it to the middle and the poor. That's what he did, and that's why he was so successful as a politician. And after the war, the corporations and the rich, angry about what had happened, achieved the reverse redistribution. We're living through that. They've moved it all back. That's what I started with today. Well, why was that possible? Why did the efforts of the 1930s, these dramatic achievements of the American people, rising up in a period of economic difficulty and making the country much less unequal by taking from the rich and giving to the middle and the bottom, we undid the inequality that had built up and became much less unequal. In the 1940s, the United States was less unequal than the countries of Europe. Today, we outstrip them in inequality. Roles have been reversed. What happened? What was the reason? Here it is, in a nutshell. When Roosevelt cut the deal that I described to you before, the deal included leaving the corporations in the hands of the shareholders and the boards of directors that the shareholders put into power. Let me remind you how a corporation works. Every year, the board of directors in a corporation, every corporation, is elected. That's how the law works in our country. How does this vote work? You get a little notice from the company that if you own shares, called a proxy notice. Some of you have gotten them. And you are told you have the right to vote your shares, because in this election, one share gets one vote. You own 10 shares, you get 10 votes. You own 1,000 shares, you get 1,000 votes. You own no shares, you get no votes. Okay? 1% of shareholders in the United States own 75% of the shares. Let me do that again. 1% of the share owners own 75%. So 1% control who's on the boards of directors, roughly speaking. And they elect whoever they want each time. The board of directors decides what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. They left those boards that way. They left those major shareholders, that's what they call the ones with the big quantities of shares, in possession. They kept the power. And guess what? As soon as Roosevelt was dead, as soon as the Depression was behind us, they went to work, these boards of directors and shareholders, to undo what the New Deal had accomplished. And because they sat at the pinnacle of the corporate structure, they had the resources to achieve their goal. The conclusion then is unescapable. If you don't want that to happen again, you cannot leave the ownership and operation of the businesses of capitalism in the hands of those people who have shown you what they want and what they will use that position to achieve. That's why to say again today, now, gee, we have such an inequality of income, we should pass a law, or pass a regulation, or redistribute income in it. Stop. We've been there, we've done that. That doesn't work. Even when you're lucky enough to achieve, for example, like in the New Deal with Roosevelt, to achieve a redistribution, it'll be undone before you can turn around. Faster next time because they have the experience since the 40s and know how to do it well. The conclusion for me follows as in this argument. You have to change the internal organization of enterprises. You cannot leave it the way it is because it doesn't work to alleviate a system that has the flaws we've listed. That's why I endorse worker co-ops or the democratization of enterprise, because that changes who's in charge, who makes the decision, and what guides them when they do that. Democratize the enterprise. Make it run like a democracy, in which everybody who's affected by the decisions of the enterprise gets a vote. One person, one vote. We are all affected if we work in an enterprise. If they move to China, we don't have a job. If they decide to use a toxic technology, we breathe the air or the water. If they decide to spend their profits by giving enormous salaries to the chief executives, we don't have enough to pay for our kids to go to school. I mean, all these decisions where we work affect our lives, and you know it. But we don't participate. Let me remind you, not that you need it, but let me remind you what democracy means. If you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it. Since we're affected by the decision of the mayor, we have the right to vote for our mayor. By the Congress, senator, or the president, we have power over them because their decisions affect us. But the people at the job you work at have power over you, lots of it. When you go to work, they tell you, sit over there, work with that machine, work in this way, stop over there, do it this way. And at the end of the day, it is that famous rule that most of you know. Whatever you've spent your brain and muscle making today stays here. You go home. And if you take any of that stuff you made home with you, people in blue uniforms come to your house and they hurt you. So we advise you not to do it. You know the rules. There's no democracy in the workplace, not in a capitalist workplace, and there never has been. But it's bizarre if you think of it, isn't it? For those of you that take democracy seriously, where do you all spend most of your adult lives? At work. 5 out of 7 days. The best hours of the day, you're at the workplace. And if you believe in democracy, that's the first place it ought to be installed. It's never been installed there. We apparently believe it's a routine, okay thing to blather on about how wonderful democracy is and not have it where we spend most of our time. We're fighting wars around the world to bring them a democracy we don't have. Let me spell out very briefly what would happen if enterprises were democratized, if we did have a cooperative structure of enterprises. Let's start with the following question that's presented to an enterprise all the time. In fact, I'm going to give it to you as an example. It's a factory. It could be a store, it could be an office, it doesn't matter. But let's use the factory, and let's say it has 300 or 400 workers. And the boss comes one day and says, oh, look, I have terrible news. I'm really sorry, but in order to compete, we're going to have to close this factory and open it in Shanghai, China. The workers' faces drop. They're terrified, they're sad, they're going to lose all of their efforts to build up their skills and their seniority and all the rest of it. The employer then waits judiciously 3-4 minutes and then says, you know, of course, if you were willing to make some concessions, we might not have to go over there. So, for example, if you give up your pension and you forget about going to the toilet during the day, and little things like that, we will stay here. And then the workers, very typical, whether they're unionized or not, scurry about and try as best they can to make a little bit less in the way of concessions than are being pushed on them, and count themselves lucky and successful if they can get that. But now imagine the workers made the decisions democratically. This would be a short vote. How many people here would like the factory to move to China, thereby losing their job and their livelihood? None? Good. That's done. Next business. It's over. It's over. No movement. No exodus as we've had for 40 years. It's not going to happen. What's basically going to happen to that factory is, if you're having some problems, you're going to have to solve them some other way, but moving to China, no longer available. And for those of you who think, oh, that's intruding upon business, let me remind you, we have intruded upon business in this country many times. Once upon a time, many businesses in this country employed people who were under 10 years of age all the time. And they made that a profitable business. And when the government came in and said you can't have child labor, they said that'll destroy America, it'll destroy capitalism, and the government said, look, We understand it's a problem, but you're going to have to solve that problem some other way, because employing kids in factories who are less than 10 years old doesn't work. We got over it. They solved their problem another way. They don't hire, at least in general, kids under 10 or 16 or whatever the break-off is. You understand? The same thing. You can solve your problem some other way. Moving to China, decimating Detroit, those are not options. You can't do that because it's socially unacceptable, just like child labor was, or sexually abusing your employees, or a whole lot of other things that we've made illegal and said you're going to have to solve your problems some other way. Let me give you another example. Democratic enterprise confronts a new technology. It'll make more profit, but it really fouls the air and the water. If you're a capitalist enterprise, the board of directors sitting often 1,000 miles away says, let's have that new technology because it makes more profit. We live in a gated community in the nice part of town. We're not going to breathe that air or drink that water in any case. But what if the workers there who have to drink the water and have to breathe the air and know that it will foul their neighborhood and their family and their children and everything? We're going to see a different set of decisions. That technology is not going to be used because even though it makes 3% more profit, it does more damage than it is worth it for those families to endure. So we won't have the kind of ecological disaster we keep producing for ourselves. Let me give you another example. The biggest cause of inequality of income and wealth is how we distribute the profits we earn each year. There it is, folks. It isn't, we don't make inequality because we pay athletes a lot, or movie stars a lot. That doesn't amount in the big picture to very much money. The really big question is, what happens to profits? Because here's how it works. Everybody works in a company to produce the profits, from the guy who cleans the toilet, to the person on the assembly line, to the secretary who keeps the records, etc., etc. We all do the parts that we're hired to do to make the company profitable. So then the question is, what happens to the profits when they're realized? If a democratic enterprise decided, guess what they'd likely do? Distribute them, a little more to this one, a little less to that one. But what would not happen is to give wild amounts of money to the CEO while everybody else can't pay for the education of their kids. That's not going to happen. You want to do something about the inequality of income and wealth? You need to democratize the enterprise. So whether it's keeping the jobs here, or doing something about ecological degradation, or doing something about inequality, then this is the way to go. This is a way to solve the problems that we haven't been able to solve before. And this way makes sure there's no undoing of what we've done, the way it happened after the New Deal. That's why the lesson of the New Deal is the need to go beyond what was done in the New Deal. Because that got undone. That didn't survive. We don't have that, and we have to learn what we didn't do in the 1930s that we could have and should have done so that we don't face now the next crisis and the next inequality and wondering what in the world we're going to do. To say the same thing, and I'll conclude with this in a different way. In the 1930s, there were those people who said, let's reform the system, and those who said, no, let's make a revolution. In that debate, and that happened, the reformers won. The revolution was put aside, partly through the story that I told you about Roosevelt. And the reformers won. We didn't make a revolution. We reformed. We passed Social Security, unemployment compensation, and public employment, and a minimum wage, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, and a whole bunch of other things. We did. We made a reform. And here's what we discovered. The reforms were difficult to achieve, and once we achieved them, proved to be vulnerable to being eliminated. We cannot ask the American people to try all again, to get together and make a movement, and then offer them a repeat of what we know already didn't work. You can't do that because they won't do it, they won't come. You've got to give American people, and this is true in every country, a plan of action, a proposal that gives them a reasonable chance to get the result that their struggles aim at. You can't do the reform trip again. You have to take the further step of transforming enterprises from top-down capitalist hierarchical institutions to democratic worker cooperatives. And for those of you that are skeptical, let me tell you the story about one of the more successful ones as my final point. It has to do with a town in the north of Spain called Mondragon. It's a little town in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. In 1956, a Roman Catholic priest in that area started a workers' co-op with 6 Basque, it's in the Basque region of Spain, Basque workers. Okay, and that company, starting in 1956, is now called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It's actually a company composed of about 250 distinct co-ops that work together. They're all co-ops. It includes roughly 100,000 workers. It is one of the most successful enterprises in the world. Its rate of growth would be the envy of the vast majority of capitalist enterprises. Along the way, it competed with capitalist enterprises all over the place and won the competition. It maintains its own university, Mondragon University, has its own bank, Caja Laboral is called, and it maintains its own research labs, where 2 American companies pay them to have their scientists work alongside of Mondragon scientists, and the 2 American companies that do that are General Motors and Microsoft. Here are some of the ways that company works. I'll just pick a few. Number 1, a rule. The highest paid person in Mondragon cannot get more than 8 times the lowest paid. In the United States, the ratio is more like 300 to 1. Here's another example. Managers, and pay attention folks, managers are hired and fired by the workers, not the other way around. Once a year, the workers get together and decide whether the managers have managed properly, and if they haven't, then bye-bye. Just imagine. Every 2 hours in the factories, not all of Mondragon's units are factories, but those that are, a bell goes off and everybody changes the work they do because it was decided that more than 2 hours doing the same task is not good for your mental health. And no worker is ever allowed or required to do more than 2 hours of a particular task before he or she is shifted. So different body movements and different eye coordination, so on, are brought into play. Unemployment in Spain now is higher than 25%. In the Basque region where they are, it's 11%. They keep people in jobs because keeping people in a job that's decent is their number 1 priority, their bottom line. Profit isn't it, it's the human being and his or her job that are. That's just a different way to run a society. It's not impossible. They have been stunningly successful at it. Nor are they the only one. Italy is the country that has the most co-ops in Europe. Why? Because they passed a law. It's called the Marcora Law, after Mr. Marcora, who was the Italian legislator that pushed it through. Here's what the law says. If you become unemployed, you have two choices. Choice number one is you go to the unemployment office and get a check for half a year, just like we do in this country. That's your option one. But you have a second option, and this is going to thrill you. If you get 9 other workers to agree with you, the government will give you your entire unemployment in a lump sum right now. You don't have to wait. You don't have to go through half a year or a year of picking up your unemployment check. You get the whole money right now, as long as you have 9 other workers who make the same decision. And here comes the second requirement. You have to use the money that the government gives you, the unemployment, to start a workers' co-op in which you will all be equal owner-operators. And the logic of the Italian theory, of the Italian legislation was, this is money we would have given to the unemployed person anyway, but we would have strung them out for half a year or a year, making them feel terrible about themselves as they come to the office to pick it up every week, losing connection with their skills, losing connection with their employer. This isn't very effective. Meanwhile, by giving them this money, we're going to have them working all the time, much better for everybody, and they're really going to be committed to making this successful because they can't go back and get unemployment if it isn't. And that this is their chance to get out of the whole dilemma of joblessness with an enterprise that's theirs. And they'll give themselves. That's why Italy has more co-ops than everybody else. No mystery, no something special about spaghetti, nothing. It's about a society that makes a commitment to begin to go in that direction. My final appeal. Americans like to think of themselves as having freedom of choice. Do we now have the following choice? To buy goods from workers who produce those goods in a democratic, cooperative way versus a top-down, hierarchical way? Answer, no. Do you all have the following free choice? Either to work in a top-down hierarchical enterprise or in a democratic worker co-op? Answer, you don't have that choice. Why? Because we haven't created a significant, well-dispersed, cooperative production sector in our economy that would let us see whether people would prefer to buy those products and to see whether Americans would prefer to work in the one environment rather than the other. So we don't have that choice. We could have it. All that is a political matter. You know, we have a small business administration in this country to help small businesses. We have a minority business administration to help minority business. We could have a cooperative business association whose job it would be to provide cheap loans and technical assistance and everything else for there to be the kind of sector that could show us all what the advantages and what the costs, the benefits and the flaws of this idea. But this is an idea that has long history in the human race. People have been interested in cooperative ways of working for thousands of years. But the reason it's now on the agenda of history is because capitalism as a system is busted. It doesn't work for everybody other than the top 10%. Every economic system of which we have any record was born, evolved, and changed over time, and then it died. Slavery came, grew, evolved, died. Feudalism came, grew, evolved, died. Capitalism was born, it has evolved, dot, dot, dot. What is it that makes it so hard for us as a nation, faced with what we're facing now, to finally emerge and say, okay, we're not proud of it. For 50 years we were too scared, too caught up in the Cold War, too traumatized to debate our economic system. Part of the reason we've got one that is so dysfunctional for so many of us now is because we didn't do it. So let's catch up. Let's try finally now to do it. I can assure you that the signs of this happening are everywhere. For the first time in 50 years, a candidate for president with the label socialist can run. Just as important, in the debate between Sanders and Clinton a couple of weeks ago, I keep telling folks this, it was very important. There's a moment at which Mrs. Clinton looks into the camera and says the following sentence. Sometimes, she said, you have to save capitalism from itself. That's the first time in 50 years that a leading candidate is defensive about capitalism. That's just as important. She has to, it's in the air. There's something wrong. When I went on the television program with Bill Maher, I had been prepared to talk about 10 different topics. Their list, not mine. Because Bill Maher doesn't decide until the last minute. It's a live program. You're on a live show, so there's no room for error. He doesn't decide till the last minute. So literally, I did not know until about 3 minutes before we go on the live station in the Paramount Studios in Hollywood, what he was going to talk to me about. And I was the first, for those of you who know, I was the first 8 minutes when he comes out on stage and he has a back and forth with one guest. That was my role. And he decided 3 minutes before that we were going to talk about Marxism. His choice, not mine. But it was a very important event, part of the very same process we're talking about. Because for 8.5 minutes in front of millions of viewers, a comedian talked with a professor about Marxism as if it were a reasonable, normal, everyday, kind of interesting conversation. As far as the audience could tell, the Marxists had no horns. And as far as the audience could tell, the comedian seemed interested in what the Marxist was saying about the subject. And then everybody went about their business. That was an act of normalizing, legitimating something that hadn't been normal and legitimate before. And it's happening everywhere. I have given 27 talks like this in the last 2 months. Not just in Tampa and St. Petersburg, Florida, in Seattle, in Fresno, California, in Bellingham, Washington, in Farmingdale, New York, in Kansas City. Monday I go to Ames, Iowa. What's going on? And the answer is, it is in the wind now. It's like coming out of hibernation as a nation. It's okay. You can exhale. We can talk like adults about an economic system and be confident that for most of us, we already know where that conversation is going. There's a political party in Germany, a powerful one, which has a funny name. It's called, in German, Die Linke, which means in German, the left. Gives you a clue where they are on the spectrum. They're called Die Linke, the left party. They have a slogan which strikes me as just the epitome of where we are. Here, by the way, in the last election, 1 out of 9 Germans votes for them. So they have a significant, big block of delegates in the parliament. They actually are the official opposition in the parliament of Germany. Here's the slogan that is very effective for them. Germany can do better than capitalism. And my simple summary is, so can we.